What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to week 2 of the SCX24 budget build-off. In this series, Matt from the Scale Builders Guild and myself take the SCX24 and we upgrade it every week on a budget. And our budget for this series is $50 a week. In week 1, with our $50 budget, I did new wheels and tires. We put beadlock wheels and larger tires on this truck. Now, I spent a little bit over the budget, just a tiny bit, 97 cents, but that amount has to come out of this week's budget. So this week, we've got $49.03 left. Now for this week's upgrades, we're mainly going to be focusing on the front end of this truck. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is installing Overdrive. Now to install Overdrive means you're going to change out the gear set that's in there for a different ratio gear set. What Overdrive refers to is spinning the axles at different speeds. Overdrive typically means spinning the front axle faster than the rear axle, and there's a number of reasons to do that. Overdrive does aid in turning. By spinning the front tires a little bit faster and adding a little bit of drag to the rear, it will tighten up your turning radius. You don't get any more steering angle, but it effectively makes the vehicle turn sharper. The other thing that it does is it helps it climb. If the rear end is getting more traction than the front, what it can tend to do is want to flip the vehicle over. So if you can spin the front faster in the right conditions, they'll grab a little bit more and they'll kind of pull the front up. The rear will continue to push up, but just not as much, which should suck you down onto the rocks quite a bit. Now, just like most things, there are some downsides to this upgrade as well. It does add an inherent binding or drag to the whole powertrain. Since this is trying to spin faster than the rear, everything has got a little bit of a bind. It's going to be harder on your motor specifically. The stock motors in the SCX24 is not the greatest. So doing this mod, make sure that you're monitoring the motor at least until you swap it out. So one thing very important to note there. The other thing that it can have an effect on is side hilling. And that's when the vehicle's at a kind of a steeper angle on the side and you're trying to reverse something. If the front is spinning and maybe it's slipping a little bit compared to the rear, it can have a tendency to want to wash downhill, not hold your line as much. Sometimes you have to point the truck uphill and kind of walk it sideways along something, which isn't always possible. But another thing to note about installing Overdrive. Now the SCX24s use worm drives. So it's a spiral or worm gear up top and then a standard gear on the bottom. To calculate the ratio of a worm drive, you just count the teeth of the bottom gear and that's the ratio because the top gear is just one tooth. So the stock SCX24 gears have 16 teeth around the bottom. So it's a 16:1 ratio. That's all there is to it with worm gears. Now, the gear set that I'm going to install for the Overdrive is made by Trial, and it's a 14 tooth. So 14:1 versus 16:1. It's going to spin it just a little bit faster than the rear. So let's jump into the installation of that, and then we'll continue to get on with the other upgrades that we're going to do for this week. To install these gears, first thing I did is remove the wheels and tires. Then I removed all of the hardware connecting the knuckles to the truck. Next, don't forget to remove the inner axle shafts. You'll also need to remove the single screw holding the drive shaft into position. Then remove the 6 screws around the center portion of the axle housing. The front axle cover will come off, exposing the gears. At this point, you can just simply pull those gears out of place. And then we're going to reverse the process to reinstall everything. Make sure that all of the bearings get swapped over. One will go onto the pinion that slides into the axle housing. One should be in that axle cover. Then there should be one on either side of the lower gear. Don't forget to add some grease to the gears before closing up the axle. At this point, I'm kind of midway through the reassembly of the axle, and I'm at the portion where we're going to install the knuckles. Now, instead of reinstalling the stock plastic knuckles, one thing that I wanted to do is look at adding some new brass knuckles. Now, the small scale trucks like this SCX24, because of how small they are, the electronics packages that normally go on top of these don't always just fit in the most convenient areas. The SCX24 has a combo ESC receiver that's fairly large. The battery pack takes up an equally large amount of space. Normally with my RCs, I like to keep all the items that go onto the chassis as low and as forward as possible. But that's just not that possible with what we're dealing with right now. So in order to try and keep the center of gravity as low as possible, our other option is to offset that by adding weight. Now, adding weight is a whole nother balance of things that you should pay attention to. You can add weight in multiple ways, of course, but one of the most important areas to consider is the difference between rotating mass versus non-rotating mass. And it's exactly like it sounds. If it's spinning or if it's not spinning, depending on what you're installing. For example, if you were to make very heavy wheels, that would be rotating mass, as you would expect your wheels to rotate. If you replace the knuckles with brass knuckles, non-rotating mass. Adding rotating mass is much more difficult on the vehicle to move. The easiest way to give you some sort of analogy of it is imagine a soccer ball and a bowling ball. You could take a soccer ball and spin it easily. If you tried the same thing with the bowling ball, it's not nearly as easy to get moving. Same thing goes with your vehicle. If you run really heavy wheels, that motor has to work a lot harder to get those things moving. So, for the most part, I like to try and keep my rotating mass fairly low. And that's why the weight that we're going to look at adding today is going to be non-rotating mass, specifically with the knuckles. This seemed like an easy choice for this week since we were already going to be disassembling a portion of the axle, and these were going to have to come off, so we might as well put the new ones on while we're doing the installation. These are from Power Hobbies. These are kind of a beefy knuckle, so they've got a good amount of added weight to them, but of course there's other options that would again give you similar results. I'll link to everything that I'm using as well as a number of options for them in the description below in case you're shopping and you'd like to see some of the parts that we're using. But I'm gonna knock out the installation of these, and then we're going to do one more thing before we wrap up this week's video. All right, we've got our knuckles installed onto the vehicle now, adding just a little bit of forward bias to it. Last thing to do this week though. Last week we installed the RC4 Overdrive steel bead locks, and something that popped up in the comments a number of times is suggestions to flip them around to run them as a deep dish wheel setup. And with the size of the tires that I installed on here, I think I'm going to try it. Now, what's specifically being referred to is that the wheel hub bolts to the inside of this wheel. Basically, I can take that wheel hub off with the 6 screws that hold the 2 halves together, and I can just move it to the other side, giving us a good amount of offset onto it. Now, offset, just like Overdrive, has pros and cons. Gives you a wider base, should make you a little bit more stable, but on the con side, it is going to be harder to fit through tight areas. If you're trying to do any sort of courses, it's harder to fit through when you're super wide often. The other thing is that it induces a lot of what's called scrub steer. Now, the kingpins on an SCX24 rotate about a point. Now, normally the tire sits close to that point, so the force needed to turn that tire is a small amount of leverage. When you move the tire further out, that servo has to do a lot more work to try and rotate that tire from a wider point. And that's what's called scrub steer. It causes the tire to move forward and backwards a lot more as well. The tighter the contact patch of the wheel is to that straight line that comes through the kingpins, the easier it is to turn the tire, and the less that it physically swings forward or rearward through the steering motion. Just like the stock motor, the stock servo also not the most beefy unit. So again, this is a modification that doing so, gonna need to watch out, and it might shorten the life even faster for that stock servo. But we're in the mindset of upgrading this vehicle anyway, so pulling all 4 of these wheels apart again, flipping those hubs around, and gonna mount them up. Currently, my track width is 112 millimeters, so we'll see what we end up with after I do this swap. So this week's modifications do make a pretty big difference as far as how this vehicle drives. I've taken the time and thrown a few battery packs through it now just inside of the house after doing the modifications, and there's a number of things that I think I can notice with it. The overdrive is noticeable. It makes a nice little difference. It's not a huge game changer, but definitely something that I think is worth doing. The little bit of extra weight up front with the brass knuckles, also a nice improvement. The greater width of the truck is nice with these tall 63mm little guy racing parts tires. So I'm glad that we did that. Now I had mentioned the scrub steer during the actual install, and let me tell you, it is completely noticeable. The servo definitely struggles a lot more to turn these tires. It already did a little bit with these tires before going to the flipped setup, and now it's just much more noticeable yet. So servo is definitely going to be one of those things that we're going to have to figure out when we can slam into this budget to make this more responsive on steering. At this point, you really have to try and keep the vehicle moving to get the steering to react how you want it to. But already with just the simple modifications that we've done, the truck is more stable, more planted, and has better performance than it did out of the box, which is a nice thing to notice already at just the end of week 2. Oftentimes, small upgrades at a time aren't the most noticeable thing, and it's just more of a sum of all things at the end that turn a rig into what it is. But to notice it already after week 2, definitely something that's pushing us in the correct direction. So for this week's budget, we spent $13.99 on the overdrive gears and $25.99 on the brass knuckles, leaving us a total spend of $39.98. Now we had $49.03 because we went 97 cents over our budget last week. That leaves us a total of $9.05 that we can carry over to next week. So a little bit larger budget for next week, allowing us to throw even more parts at it. Hopefully you guys are enjoying these. Make sure and watch these every Wednesday. Make sure and go check out Matt's video as well, which I've linked in the description below. For those of you that already own SCX24s, drop in the comments below which SCX24 you have, or which one is your favorite if you have multiples, or which one you're looking at if you haven't bought one yet. Drop it in the comments below. We'll get some conversation going down there. But as always, I appreciate you guys watching the budget build every Wednesday. Hit the like button if you enjoy these videos. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. As always, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.